today. This is our first Zoom program that I'm doing, and there is alcohol involved. So what could go wrong, right? Please bear with us with any technological glitches that happen as we go along here, because they are probably my fault, and we'll just work through them all together, right? It's a strange new time. We're learning new tricks. So this is going to be, oh, and Sally will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions or problems, just go ahead and fire them out there. I have the chat box open on my screen also, so I can see what's going on, but I might get a little bit hyper-focused here, or maybe not, we'll see. So Art at Happy Hour, we're going to be doing this as a monthly program where a staff member will pair some art with a beverage. And it's just meant to be a nice, easygoing, fun, and relaxing chance to experience some art together. So I hope you'll just kick back and relax. One of my favorite things about looking at art with people stems from the realization that art is something that every culture in the history of mankind has in common. Every culture across the world has experienced art, uses art. I mean, if you think back to cave people, right? Go back to prehistory, 20,000 years ago, we had people creating art. So this is something that every culture has in common and can connect cultures across space and time. So I think that's pretty awesome. But you know what else every culture in the history of mankind has in common? Beer. Yep, it's true. Beer. Archaeologists have found traces of beer making going back as far as 13,000 years. And in modern times, we've got it down to a pretty good and enjoyable science. I have mine right here, but just look at that beautiful beer rainbow down there in the right-hand corner. It definitely makes me thirsty. So I like to think of this as art as sustenance for the soul, and beer is sustenance for the body. That's the reason people 13,000 years ago were making beer. It was a way to add calories to your diet, and I can attest to that. So why don't we get started? I'll show you what I'm pairing up tonight. I have selected for us these two portraits that are in the MSV collection. And I'm going to be pairing them up with this beer, Samuel Adams Boston Lager. You will find some pretty obvious reasons for me doing this pairing, putting this beer with these paintings, and eventually you will see some not so obvious reasons why I'm making this connection. But that's kind of the fun of it, right? So why don't we jump in, grab the beverage of your choice if you haven't already done so, and let's look at some art. Ladies first, right? Let us begin with this one. This is Lucinda Smith, Mrs. George Alexander Otis by Gilbert Stuart, painted around 1809. And just give yourself a minute to feast your eyes on this lovely portrait. What do you notice about her? I'm going to zoom in for a little more detail. When you get in this close, you can see some brush strokes, which from the far away view, you couldn't see at all. All you could see was just her beautiful skin. And it is lovely, isn't it? And check out that, the lace, the nice expression on her face. Got the little wispy curls around her face. I'll give you a different view here. What I was going for here was the dress and the lace, okay? So try to stay focused. What material do you think her dress is made of? Yeah, I think velvet too. Nice, beautiful black velvet, and that lace. You can see here how the artist has created the image of this lace, and it's just layers and shades of gray and white. And look at her hand. Isn't that amazing? I think it's just really beautifully done. And let's check out Mr. Otis. Also 1809. These were a pair. We suspect it might have been in honor of their wedding, which was a few years earlier. So we're not sure about that. I'm not going to zoom in on him because I don't like his outfit as much as I liked her outfit, but it's still really, really handsomely done here with fine detail by the artist. So here they are back together again. Pendant portraits, these are often called, not because they fit in pendants, but because they would be a pair together. And they were often hung on either side of a doorway or a window or a mirror, traditionally. So what do we think we might know about these people just by looking at their portraits? Wealth, yes, for sure. These are obviously wealthy people. Just their clothes, the lace, the velvets, the details, all of those are really good clues. Another good clue is just the fact that they had their portraits painted, and portraits painted by someone who was good. I mean, if you didn't recognize Gilbert Stuart's name, you never heard of him before, you would still recognize that these were finely done paintings. And indeed, they were very wealthy people. They lived in Boston, evidently on Boylston Street in Boston. And there is a Otis House Museum in Boston. You see it up there at the top of the screen in red, Otis House Museum. It is not these two Otises, however, from that museum. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see Boylston Street, and you will see Otis House Museum up there at the top. That house belonged to distant cousins of George and Lucinda. And in fact, we have on here with us today a museum professional from the Otis House Museum who helped us out with some research on this. And I think we figured out that they are third cousins between these two Otises, so across Boston Commons from each other. So you can see Boylston Street down there at the bottom of the map. Also just going to give a shout out to Suffolk University there. We have Gina Versa here with us today, who happens to work at Suffolk University. So shout out to my Boston peeps. Let's see here. So wealthy people. Now, I know everybody always, it's gauche to talk about money, you know, it's tacky, but everybody always wants to know, where did they get the money? Well, George and Lucinda got their money the old-fashioned way. They inherited it. They inherited it from her father. This is her father, Barney Smith. Now, I should also mention that George and Lucinda happened to be first cousins, which sounds a little Kentucky to us today. But in those days, it was fairly common. And when you think about it, it's a great way to keep the money, keep the wealth in the family, right? So George was a business partner of Lucinda's father, Barney Smith. And Barney was a merchant. Evidently, he was involved in some import-export business and did very, very well for himself. After the governor of Virginia from the British, when they were a British colony, when the governor for the colony was run out, yeah, I know, Jessica, I had to get that Kentucky in there, was run out of the country and had to go back to England, Governor Hutchinson, Barney Smith owned the governor's mansion after that. Not directly after that, I think there was one owner in between, but that's the kind of wealth they had. So when Barney passed away, George and Lucinda inherited enough money to allow George to retire from business and devote himself to travel and languages and being a man of letters. So how did they come to have these portraits painted by Gilbert Stuart, who at the time was one of the premier portraitists in America? Well, let's dig in a little deeper here. So here's Gilbert Stuart with a striking self-portrait on the left from 1775. And then later in life, a portrait painted by his daughter, Jane Stuart, who is also a fairly well-respected artist. We have a couple of pieces by her in our collection at the MSV as well. And they happen to be portraits of George and Martha Washington that were originally attributed to Gilbert Stuart, but now we believe they were actually by Jane. So Gilbert Stuart was born in the colony of Rhode Island in 1755. But his family, they were loyalists. And before the Revolutionary War started, he left and went back to England in 1775, where he studied with some pretty prominent artists such as Benjamin West, and he was pretty successful. He exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1777. And kind of his breakthrough painting was The Skater, which was painted in 1782. Some of you, if you're, art aficionados, may have seen that painting before. But this led to many more commissions for Gilbert Stuart. He had a problem, though. His problem was with money. So despite the fact that he was doing pretty well and having a lot of successful commissions, he had a problem with money, and he also had a bit of a problem with actually finishing projects. So I can't see my date up there, but what year did he leave? 1787. He had to leave London, and by he had to leave, I mean it was a situation of leave or be thrown in debtor's prison. So he left London and went to Dublin, where in Dublin he ran into the same problems and eventually had to come back to the States. But he came back with a plan. He came back in 1793, and his plan was to make money. And how was he going to make money? Well, what if he painted George Washington? I mean, obviously, if you paint the President of the United States, it's going to lead to a lot more commissions, and you're going to be able to sell a lot of those paintings, and this would be a really good thing. So he came to New York initially and just started trying to make contacts who would get him to Washington. And John Jay was sort of the pivotal person that he painted, such consonants there, who introduced him to Washington. So he moved to Philadelphia in 1795, and he painted Washington that year. And this is the iconic painting that he created. Notice that it's unfinished, one of the problems. But he used this unfinished portrait of Washington as sort of his model, and he recreated it many, 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 many times. So here's a little zoom in on that. Pretty good, huh? And if it looks really familiar to you, might be because of this. It's the image on the dollar bill. Here's another version. This one is known as the Lansdowne portrait, the full body portrait. So Nancy has a good question. How old was Washington at the time of the sitting? I don't know. Let me think about that, and I'll try to answer that at the end. And maybe Sally can Google it for me in the meantime, because I don't know how old George Washington was in 1796. So yes, this is in the National Portrait Gallery, but Stuart painted this at least 4 times. So there are at least 4 versions of this Lansdowne portrait. This is the version that Dolly Madison rescued from the White House in 1812, when the White House, or during the War of 1812, I should say, when the White House was set on fire. Now, obviously, if you paint the president, your stock in the art world rises. For example, Kehinde Wiley, who recently painted President Obama's portrait. And Kehinde was doing pretty well already, don't get me wrong, as was Stuart. But this is a great segue into really having your star rise as an artist. If you have painted the president, you are the big deal. So not only did he paint George Washington, Gilbert Stuart painted all 6 of the first 6 presidents of the United States. These 2, for example, and John Adams. Do you see where I'm going with this? I think it's time to take a sip. Yes, so he painted John Adams, who was also from Massachusetts. So that's easy. Notice the date on this, where it says circa 1800, 1815, another one of the unfinished portraits, I imagine, that eventually got finished. But John Adams brings me around to his second cousin, Samuel Adams. Ta-da! I bet you saw that coming. So here we have Samuel Adams, second cousin of John Adams, well known as the father of the American Revolution, the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Tea Party, Continental Congress. He went on to serve as the governor of Massachusetts right after John Hancock. And he nominated George Washington to be general of the Continental Army. And he believed that for our republic, that if the leaders lacked virtue, then liberty was endangered. Wise words indeed. This portrait was recreated as an engraving by none other than Paul Revere. Here we see the engraving. I wish I could go back really easily, but I'm afraid I'm going to screw up my presentation. But this engraving is definitely a reproduction of that Copley painting. I don't think that the perspective turned out quite as well. You be the judge. But there's some little symbols in here that Revere included, like the Magna Carta down at the bottom. One of the ladies is standing on laws to enslave Americans. That's not a reference to African Americans. That's a reference to British laws that enslaved colonial Americans. Notice a little Patriot's cap up there on the one lady's spear. So Revere took a little artistic license here, but not as much as the marketing team at Samuel Adams took. Look how hunky they make Sam Adams look here in their logo. Nice job, guys. I love that it says brewer and patriot. There is some debate in the historical world as to whether or not Samuel Adams actually was a brewer. I'm leaning towards not. He was actually a maltster. He came from a long line of maltsters, and Malt House was the family business. But a lot of people don't know what a maltster does or what a malt house is, so therefore I think that's why he got the reputation as being a brewer. If you're curious, I will tell you. I know you're curious. You want to know what a maltster does or what a maltster is. Well, I just happen to know that the maltster's job is to take the grain, the green grain that is necessary for brewing. And because you can't just brew with the fresh grains, that doesn't work. So what you have to do is you take your barley or wheat or what have you, and you take the grain, they expose it to moisture so that the grain germinates. And this process creates the enzymes that are going to be needed in that grain for the brewing process. The enzymes get activated in brewing and turn into the starches that turn into the sugars that the yeast has to eat to cause fermentation. So very important job. So a maltster would supply individuals who are brewing or brew houses with the grains that they needed. You can also toast the malt to different levels to get different types of flavors in your beers. So like with a stout, you're gonna really roast that malt and make it nice and dark and toasty. That's where some of that stuff happens. So that whole Boston connection was my main reason for choosing this beer. But in the course of my research, I found so much more. Remember when I said earlier that George retired and became a man of letters and languages? Well, his biggest project was translating into English from Italian Charles Botta's History of the War of the Independence of the United States of America. So this was an Italian who wrote a history of the War of Independence. And George translated it from the Italian into English. And once he had done that, he took it upon himself to send a copy to all of the founding fathers who were still alive. So he sent a copy to Madison, he sent a copy to Jefferson, he sent a copy to John Adams. And in the Library of Congress, on their website, you can find all this correspondence between George Otis and these founding fathers. And you might want to go ahead and look that up because it's kind of interesting, but I will just warn you that most of the correspondence is Otis saying, did you get my book? Did you read my book? Did you like my book? So he wanted some validation. But it is kind of interesting because there's some correspondence between Otis and Jefferson and Otis and Adams. That's my other connection here. The correspondence is about how accurate or inaccurate some of the speeches that are in the translation are. So kind of interesting. So there you go. There's connection number 2. But wait, there's more. When I selected these portraits in this beer, there was another connection I had no idea about. Here's Lucinda again. And this is information that's on our website. And as I was researching the portrait and reading the provenance, it was really interesting to see where this portrait went over the course of time. And as Sally mentioned at the beginning of the program, if you were paying attention to her introduction of me, you know that I'm from Cincinnati. And the running joke, I know way too much about Cincinnati. The running joke in our office is that I can connect anything to Cincinnati, Ohio. Well, lo and behold, if you read down in the provenance here, you will see that this portrait went to Cincinnati, Ohio, with the daughter of the sitter, Sarah Otis Ernst. So Sarah inherited the portraits. She got married to someone in Cincinnati and moved there and took the portraits with her. Crazy, I know. But what's interesting about Lucinda is that she was a big-time abolitionist in Boston. And her house on Boylston Street was headquarters for many meetings with the likes of William Lloyd Garrison, for example, and the big abolitionists of the day. Well, her daughter, Sarah, the apple did not fall far from the tree. And she also was an abolitionist, and she married an abolitionist from Cincinnati named Andrew Ernst. And they moved to Cincinnati, and there Andrew was painted by Robert Duncanson, an African-American artist who was based in Cincinnati at the time, and painted a whole group of the prominent abolitionists in Cincinnati. And here you see this pose is not too terribly different from that George Washington portrait at Lansdowne that we saw earlier. So, but wait, there's even more. There's our Cincinnati connection, but also when I started this project, little did I know, when I chose this nice Boston lager, I had to do a little research on the Boston Beer Company. And I discovered that it was founded in 1984 by a Harvard graduate, hence the Boston, who was tired of drinking wimpy beers, and he wanted to drink good beer. And this is sort of the beginning of the craft beer revolution. So he used a family recipe to create this Boston lager. This was his great-great-grandfather's recipe. And the founder's name is Jim Cook. And it just so happens that he's from, you guessed it, Cincinnati, Ohio. And he found this recipe in his great-great-grandfather, or in his grandfather's attic in Cincinnati. Sure enough. So Lucinda's portrait, great-grandfather, all this stuff was happening in Cincinnati at the same time. Samuel Adams, the Boston Beer Company, they have a big Midwestern brewery there in Cincinnati. And in, I guess, fall of 2018, they opened this swank looking tap room that you see down there on the left in the Over the Rhine neighborhood in Cincinnati. So now, getting back to the Otis's time period, when they were living in New England, they would have not been drinking a lager. So my beer choice is somewhat inauthentic to the time period in which they were living. We don't really get lagers here in America until we see the big influx of German immigrants in the 1840s, mid 18th century. So, okay, bad on me, but hey, in the age of COVID-19, I was not going to make a whole separate trip to the grocery store to get the Boston Ale. So we have the lager today. But during the Otis's time period, brewing was very often woman's work. A housewife would be making her bread and making her beer. Now, Lucinda Otis, I'm sure, never made beer in her life. I don't know that for sure, but I'm guessing that a wealthy family like that, she would have had servants who made their beer, or more likely they ordered beer from merchants, from brew houses, so that they would have good fresh beer. They would have been drinking ales and porters. These were the more traditional types of beer that English settlers in New England would have brought with them, along with their skepticism of drinking water. Beer was a staple of everybody's diet back in those days. And eventually, men take over the brewing industry and professionalize it and commercialize it, and are brewing on larger scales and providing more households with beers and taverns and all that sort of stuff. So how was this done, you may be wondering? Well, I just happen to know, because I have visited a brewery that is set up to brew the historic way, with none of the stainless steel stuff you see at modern breweries, no electricity. These guys at the Carillon Brewing Company in Dayton, Ohio, brew the old-fashioned way. And it's very gravity dependent because they don't have pumps and things. I happen to know all this because if you are as big of a history nerd as me, you would ask for brewer for a day as a Christmas gift and go and do that, which I did. So it was super exciting. There's a pulley there where you hoist the grains up to the top level of that platform, and they went in the oak barrel at the top. And you can see sort of a sluice up there that brought the boiling water from the kettle into the mash tun. And then eventually from there, it goes to the next step. Ooh, this is a video. Let's hope it works. I don't know if it will. Might not. But you can see the beer coming out of the mash kettle. And eventually, ooh, it did work. Check that out. You can see the steam coming off it. And then eventually it goes into a wooden keg where it ferments and becomes beer. And that is the end of my story. So I have to give Sally Meyer shout out. She gets the credit for creating the Otises holding their beers.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I didn't see a ton of questions coming in that weren't answered sort of as we went. We did have a question about women of the Otis's class drinking beer, but I think you pretty much answered that.
Yeah, they would have definitely would have had beer.
Great.
Probably not like at a party. Oh, and this was the other thing, that during the Revolution and etc., beer drinking was encouraged, especially drink local, because for a couple of reasons. One was it prevented people from drinking imported beverages like wine and spirits that would have been imported and taxed. And also because beer has a lower alcohol content than the whiskey that was being distilled here. And winemaking kind of took a while for us to get it going here in the States. So
Yeah.
beer would have been just a dietary staple. So they wouldn't have had it at celebrations, you know, if she was entertaining, having a fancy party or something. But
Yeah.
women, children drank beer. Everybody drank beer.
And I've allowed everyone to unmute themselves. So if there are any last questions or things you'd like to ask in person, feel free to unmute your video, unmute your microphone. I see a question from Kathleen. Is there significance to the colors of their backgrounds?
No, I don't think so. I think that was just an artist choice.
Yeah, it's interesting that where the lighter portions of the backgrounds, they do kind of match each other.
Susie wants to know how long did it take to ferment? It takes about 2 weeks for an ale to ferment. It takes longer for a lager to ferment. And lagers, the difference between a lager and an ale is mostly in the yeast, but can also be in the flavoring ingredients like the malt or the hops that are chosen. But lagers need to rest at a lower temperature for a longer period of time generally to ferment. And how did 18th century beer taste? Well, get on up to Carillon Brewing Company and you can find out. They taste pretty darn good. This beer, for example, is old 18th century recipe. Tastes pretty good to me. It's still a pretty darn good beer, I gotta say. Lucinda only drinks from a glass. Yes. Nice.
All right. Well,
any other questions?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you.
So fiery. I like that. Yeah, so come back next month. Sally's up next. She's going to do next month's pairing of art and beverage.
I can't promise the depth of knowledge about the beverage as Mary's, but I'm planning to talk about some of the Italian landscapes in our collection and some of the sculpture and pair that with some Italian wine. So should be fun. Hope you all join us. I will be sending out a survey following very shortly. So definitely fill that out. Let us know what you thought, things you think we should change. That would be wonderful.
Sally, do you know the date for next month's yet?
June 9th, but it's not quite on our website yet for registration, but it'll definitely be up in the next couple weeks.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for the kickoff of Art at Happy Hour.
Cheers.
Cheers. See you next time.